So in the last section, you learned how to build RESTful APIs using Express. But in that section, we used a simple array to manage the list of our courses. In real-world applications, however, instead of using an array in memory, we use a database. Now, before I teach you how to access a database in Node, I want to make sure that you have a good and in-depth understanding of asynchronous programming. And that's the topic for this section. So, back in the terminal, let's create a new folder for this section, async demo. Let's go in this folder and do an npm init with the yes flag. Okay, beautiful. We have a new Node project, and now let's open this folder in our favorite editor. Now, let's add a new file, index.js. In this file, I'm going to write a couple of console.log statements. So console.log, before, and then after. This is an example of synchronous or blocking program. In this program, when the first line executes, the program is blocking, and the second line has to wait until the first line finishes execution. So that's why we call programs like this synchronous or blocking. In contrast, we have asynchronous or non-blocking program. Let me show you an example of an asynchronous program. So in JavaScript, we have this function that you should be familiar with, setTimeout. This takes two arguments. The first one is a function. So I'm using the arrow function syntax. So let's pass 2000 milliseconds or 2 seconds here. After 2 seconds, the code inside this function will be executed. So I'm going to use this to simulate a call to a database that is going to take 2 seconds. So let's do a console.log, reading a user from a database. So I'm simulating the action of reading a user from a database that is going to take 2 seconds. Now, when we run this program, what do you think we're going to see in the console? Someone may think, first we're going to see this message before, then the program is going to wait for 2 seconds, and then we're going to display the second message, and finally the third message. But that's not how this program works. Let's have a look. So back in the terminal, node index.js. See what happened? We have before, after, and then read a user from a database. Also, what is more interesting is that before and after are displayed immediately, and then we have the wait of 2 seconds. Let me show you one more time. So look, before and after, now 1, 2, and here's the third message. So let's see what's happening here. This setTimeout function is an example of an asynchronous or non-blocking function. When we call this function will schedule a task to be performed in the future. In this case, 2 seconds after. So 2 seconds after, it will call this function that we pass as the first argument. So when we run this program, first, the first line is executed, then we get to the second line. Now, all this function does is scheduling a task to be performed in the future. It doesn't wait. It doesn't block. It just schedules a task, and then the control is returned. So then we'll get to line 5 and display this after message in the console. So that's why when we run this program, first we see before, then immediately after we see after, and 2 seconds later, when this function is executed, we get this message about reading a user from a database. So this is the difference between synchronous and asynchronous code. Now, one thing I need to clarify here is that asynchronous does not mean concurrent or multi-threaded. In this application, in this program, we have a single thread. So our single thread first executes the first line, then schedules a function to be called in 2 seconds. Next, it will display this message in the console, and after that, it will be free. So in 2 seconds from now, it will execute this function and display this message on the console. Earlier in the course, I gave you a metaphor. Remember this imaginary restaurant? So in a synchronous restaurant, when you get a table, the waiter comes to you, takes your order, gives it to the kitchen, and then sits there waiting until your food is ready before moving on to the next table. This is an example of a synchronous or blocking restaurant. In contrast, in an asynchronous restaurant, the waiter doesn't wait in the kitchen. So while the chef is preparing your meal, the waiter will move on to the next table to take their order. What is important here is that we have a single waiter or waitress. This is like a single thread in a program. So we don't have multiple threads. We don't have concurrency. Now, why do you need to know all this? Because in Node programs, whenever you're dealing with an operation that involves disk or network access, you're dealing with asynchronous code. So you need to understand how asynchronous code behaves. And more importantly, you need to know how to write asynchronous code in a clean and maintainable way. And that's what you're going to learn in this section.